The explorer dived into an underwater cave with the group, but was suddenly fascinated by curiosity on the way the group briefly, and then got lost in the dark abyss. He frantically called for help in fear, and the rescue team was not far from his location. The closest distance was only 100 feet, but he ended up trapped in the cave for 6 weeks, starving to death. Hope is close at hand, but it has been dashed again and again. This is probably the most desperate way to die in the history of cave diving. Today, let's talk about the Sterkfontein Cave incident. Located in Gauteng, South Africa, about 40 kilometers from Johannesburg, the largest city in South Africa, the Sterkfontein Caves is a historic prehistoric cultural site. In August 1936, Robert Broom came to the Sterkfontein Cave to carry out excavations and discovered for the first time the adult skull of Australopithecus africanus about 2.6 million to 3 million years ago. In the years that followed, Professor Broom discovered the famous Mrs. Please skull about 2.5 million years old and stone tools used by prehistoric humans. In the late 90s, Ronald J. Clark found a fossil known as Littlefoot in the cave, which is about 3 million years old and is currently the oldest human ancestor skeleton in the world. This series of remarkable archaeological discoveries has made the Sterkfontein Caves the richest source of Australopithecus fossils in Africa, providing an important basis for exploring and studying the origin and development of humans. In 1999, the site of the Cradle of Humanity, where the Sterkfontein Caves are located, was inscribed on the World Heritage List, and a year later, Sterkfontein was declared a World Heritage Site. However, the history of the cave is only one side of the cave. In fact, there is another face to this cave. It is dangerous, mysterious, and even killing people secretly. Why? In fact, the Sterkfontein Cave is a karst cave developed in the dolomite, and the cave is divided into two parts, namely the dry cave in the upper layer and the wet water cave below. If the Sterkfontein Cave is subdivided, its interior can be roughly divided into 4 areas, namely Lincoln Cave, Silberberg Cave, Milner Hall, and Jakavik Cave. Lincoln Cave is mainly composed of fossil deposits, and a large number of small animal fossils and stone artifacts have been unearthed in the cave, which provides important clues for the study of prehistoric animals and human survival and evolution. The Silberberg Grottos are a treasure trove of prehistoric cultures, where scientists have found many million-year-old prehistoric human fossils, including the famous Littlefoot hominid fossil discovered by Professor Clark. Lake Milner is part of the wet underground area of Sterkfontein, located in Milner Hall, and is one of the most important archaeological areas in the cave, where some early human fossils have been excavated. Lake Milner is also the most well-known in the entire cave system, and a diving event in 1984 made it world famous. Compared to the first 3, there is less exploration of Jakavik Cave. As a typical karst cave, the rocks on the top and inside of the cave are unstable and have the risk of collapsing and falling at any time. Wet water is more dangerous than dry caverns, and the underwater world is intricately constructed, with countless holes, underground rivers and air pockets, and the deepest depths of the water can reach depths of up to 60 meters. To this day, there are still many unknown caves in the wet water area that have not yet been discovered by humans. The twisted underwater cave structure has earned it the nickname Swiss cheese by divers. In short, the Sterkfontein Cave can be described as a hole in a hole, and it is completely a natural labyrinth. But that's just the tip of the iceberg of the horrors of the Sterkfontein Cave. The environment of the underwater cave of Sterkfontein is extremely harsh, with high humidity, low temperature, and poor visibility, and humans are very susceptible to hypothermia and shock in this environment for a long time. If a novice diver rushes into the wet area without a guide rope and guide, he is likely to lose his way in a short period of time and even endanger his life. But the dangers of the Sterkfontein Cave are also fascinating, especially the wet waters, which attract many people to delve into the uncharted mysteries. Among the diving enthusiasts who entered the Sterkfontein Caves, Nuno Gomes, Malcolm, Peter Verhulsel are the most famous. They are the protagonists of this issue. Now let's travel to 1984 and see what really happened back then. Nuno, Malcolm, and Peter were the iron triangle of the University of the Witwatersrand Underwater Club, and they often went on exploration activities in uncharted waters together. Of the three, Nuno, the team leader, had the most diving experience, followed by Malcolm and Peter last. Nuno was born in Lisbon, Portugal, and moved to Pretoria, South Africa at the age of 14. Nuno was an obsessive diver and talented in diving, holding 2 world records in deep diving that have been independently verified and approved by Guinness World Records. In 1996, Nuno dived into South Africa's deepest cave, which is located at more than 100 meters of sea level and has a water depth of more than 283 meters. Divers can suffer from decompression sickness if they are not careful during the diving process. Here is a brief introduction to decompression sickness. Decompression sickness is a systemic disease caused by the formation of bubbles due to the pressure reduction of gases, mainly nitrogen, that were originally dissolved in the blood and tissues under high pressure when a person quickly enters a low-pressure environment after working in a high-pressure environment. Decompression sickness is common in deep divers, and the main symptoms are dizziness, decreased hearing ability, joint and muscle pain, and so on. And in severe cases, pulmonary edema. Peruvian fisherman Martinez suffered from decompression sickness due to the improper speed of his ascent during a deep dive, and the nitrogen in his blood formed dense air sacs around his muscles, causing him to suffer from decompression sickness due to his swollen joints, paralysis, itchy skin for many years. In the previously mentioned Bushman's Hole incident, the survivor also suffered from decompression sickness due to the rapid ascent, causing permanent damage to his body. In other words, even experienced divers are not guaranteed to completely get rid of the shadow of decompression sickness. Therefore, Nuno must strictly follow the decompression schedule during the deep dive to reach the same sea level depth of 339 meters in order to prevent decompression sickness. In the end, with his superb diving skills, Nuno took 14 minutes to descend to the water, and it took about 4 minutes to descend to the bottom. And it took 12 hours and 15 minutes to successfully complete the extremely difficult diving mission and retreat. In June 2005, Nuno completed a 318.25 meter deep dive in the Red Sea using a closed-circuit breathing apparatus with a total dive time of 12 hours, setting a record for open water diving. It is worth mentioning that Nuno was one of the 4 divers who dived with scuba equipment at an underwater depth of 300 meters, the other 3 being diver Ahmed Gaber, Mark Elliott, and the late John Bennett. In addition, Nuno worked with veteran diver Sheck Exley to develop a dive program that led to the standardization of deep diving technology. However, Nuno's near-perfect career also had its share in the incident of diving in the Sterkfontein Caves. On September 29, 1984, the trio led by Nuno decided to measure the depth of Milner Hall in the wet area of the Sterkfontein Cave. They planned to lay a permanent guideline from the entrance to the cave to the entrance to Lake Milner, and the trio followed the guideline to the end of the cave before returning the same way. The depth of the water was only 4 meters, and the difficulty of the dive was equivalent to a recreational dive, so it was expected that the task could be completed in about 1 hour. At 10:45 a.m., the trio entered the cave, and they first walked through the dry cave, and in about half an hour or so, they successfully arrived at their destination, Lake Milner. The trio then divided the work according to their level of diving experience, with Nuno laying the guideline from the entrance of Lake Milner to the small air pockets at the end of the channel, and Peter and Malcolm assisting Nuno from the surface. Nuno had already dived into the Sterkfontein Cave twice before, and he knew the inside of the cave so well that he quickly laid a 396-foot, 120-meter guideline. After the guideline was laid, the 3 of them followed the guideline through the dense water passage and reached the small air pocket at the end of the main passage in about 40 minutes. The small air pockets were small and looked unremarkable, but no human footprints had been there for millions of years before. As the first warriors to set foot here, the trio were proud of their bravery, and they chatted enthusiastically, but they never imagined that this would be the last time they talked. After the conversation, the trio returned on their original route, and it was estimated that they would reach the entrance to Milner Lake in 10 minutes. As always, Nuno was at the front of the line, Malcolm was in the middle, and Peter was last. But it didn't take long for Nuno to feel Malcolm pulling his fin from behind, and he couldn't help but be a little angry when he looked back. Peter's flashlight flickered not far away, and he had escaped the guide rope without permission and was trying to get into a strange cave. Curiosity was a no-no, and they were traversing a passage only 13 feet deep, which was deep, narrow, and dark, and it was easy to get lost if they fell behind. So Nuno swam to Peter, pulled him back, and signaled that he should not be left behind, and Peter did as he was told, and the three of them continued to swim towards the mouth of the cave. However, only a few minutes later, when Nuno and Malcolm returned to Lake Milner through the narrow passage, they found Peter missing again. So the two of them had no choice but to swim back to the end of the passage and look for Peter along the various forks in the road. But they never found Peter. For the next 4 hours or so, Nuno and Malcolm tried their best to find Peter in the water, but to no avail, until they ran out of oxygen before they had to swim out of the cave to replace the oxygen cylinder. After replacing the oxygen cylinders, the duo notified the fire brigade. The fire brigade divers arrived and assessed the situation inside the cave, but refused to enter the water because they were not able to cope with the complex terrain inside the cave. They were not professional. This made Nuno anxious, and he knew that if he didn't find Peter in a short time, Peter wouldn't be able to survive long with the harsh natural conditions in the cave. Nuno immediately contacted Stevenson, who had dived in the cave with him a few weeks earlier. Stevenson rushed to the cave and changed into an oxygen cylinder and went into the water with Nuno and Malcolm to find Peter. It was only in the evening that police divers arrived at the Sterfontein cave and took over the work of the fire brigade divers. The search and rescue work continued until more than 2 a.m. when Nuno and Malcolm had been in the water for more than 14 hours and had developed hypothermia and had to go ashore to rest temporarily. Due to the large number of people who went into the water to search and rescue, the water in the cave had long been muddy. Even if divers went into the water again to search and rescue, they would find nothing because of blurred vision. As a result, the police announced that the cave would be temporarily cordoned off until the water quality was good, and that no civil society organizations would be allowed to dive into the water for the rescue, including Nuno and Malcolm and others. Nuno thought that the police's arrangement was to recharge his energy and create better conditions for rescuing Peter, but he didn't expect that the police would spend several days just cleaning up the mud in the water, let alone trying their best to rescue Peter. For more than a month, the police divers only went into the water on weekends to search and rescue, and the divers only did a cursory search at the bottom of the cave, never going to the side holes and air pockets. The police judged that Peter's remaining oxygen was not enough to support him in the water, so he must have drowned long ago. Since the person was already killed, there was no need to waste police resources to rescue Peter. Nuno questioned this, telling the police that he had dived into the Sterkfontein caves several times, was very familiar with the underwater environment, and that there were many oxygen-rich air pockets underwater, and that Peter had probably swam into the air pockets. How could he be so arbitrarily sentenced to death? But the police ignored Nuno's questioning. Nuno and the civilian search and rescue organization were never able to enter the water because of the police blockade order. So, was Peter really killed at this time, as judged by the police? In fact, Nuno's judgment is the most accurate. Peter was really waiting for rescue in the air pocket in the water at this time. Unlike Nuno and Malcolm's cautiousness, Peter was a man who satisfied his curiosity despite danger. On his way back to Lake Milner, Peter was fascinated by the unknown caves on both sides of the tunnel. After leaving the team for the first time and being forcibly brought back by Nuno, he still felt reluctant to part with these caves in his heart. Eager to enter a new entrance or discover the remains of ancient humans from an unknown cave, Peter left the guide rope again and entered an unknown cave on the side, taking advantage of Nuno and Malcolm's inattention. When Peter entered the cave, he found that there were many forks in the cave, and he couldn't resist the temptation to go all the way with a flashlight. But the light in the water was dim, and his flashlight could only illuminate a small area at a time, and he soon lost the way he came. It was only then that Peter felt the fear. He found himself in a completely unfamiliar environment, and he couldn't go back to find the guide rope, and Nuno and Malcolm were completely gone. Because Peter swam far and fast, the mud and sand in the water were stirred up by him, causing the water to become more and more muddy and blurred, so that Peter was completely lost. Peter's diving experience was not as good as that of Nuno and Malcolm, but it was still much better than that of a novice diver. He swam as far as he could towards the light, hoping to find other exits. After an unknown amount of time, Peter saw a silvery glow on the surface of the water, and he struggled to swim into an unknown small air pocket filled with oxygen. At this time, Most of the oxygen that Peter was carrying had been used up, and the abundance of oxygen in the small air pockets was a blessing and misfortune for Peter. This oxygen could help Peter keep going, but he didn't know the way out. If he ran out of oxygen and couldn't find the air pockets, he would drown due to lack of oxygen. Therefore, Peter chose to stay where he was and wait for rescue. Peter judged that he had not been missing for a long time and that his two teammates should not be far from him. So he put the light of the flashlight into the water and kept changing the direction of the light, hoping that his teammates would see the light and rush to rescue him. After waiting for hours to no avail, Peter guessed that his teammates must have run out of oxygen and went ashore to replace the gas cylinders and look for the rescue team. So Peter picked up the oxygen cylinder and struck the rock with all his might, thinking that the rescue team would soon get him out when they heard the knock. In fact, Peter's judgment and approach were not wrong, but he did not expect the police rescue team to be so inefficient. After all, the police had always treated Peter as a victim, so they had always pretended to rescue Peter. Returning to Peter's side, his strength was exhausted by the slamming of the rock with his oxygen cylinder. After a long time, Peter fell asleep under the influence of cold and exhaustion. Before that, Peter turned off the flashlight in order to save power. When Peter woke up again, he was desperate to find himself in a dark and silent world, with no one in the air pockets, and even the sound of water was completely still. In such an environment, he quickly lost his sense of time. Human beings are social creatures. Once they lose their visual stimulation and are in a completely silent world, their bodily functions will gradually collapse. To make matters worse, Peter had no food to feed his hunger, and the temperature in the air pockets was only 3 degrees Celsius, which could kill him at any time. Still, Peter decided to live. Unable to wait for the rescue team, Peter guessed that the rescue team thought he had drowned and withdrew the rescue of him. Determined to save himself, Peter turned on his flashlight and walked to the edge of the cavitation with the remaining light source, walking about 120 feet down a path. Unfortunately, this was a dead end, and Peter had to return to the air pockets in disappointment to wait for help. So, what did Peter's ending look like? On November 3rd, 1984, exactly 36 days had passed since Peter's disappearance. The police could not find Peter's body, so they had to announce that the search and rescue had stopped. The Sterkfontein cave was reopened, but only the dry cave was opened, and no one was allowed to enter the underwater cave. When the cave opened to the public, the South African Cavern Society entered the chamber to find the relationship between the dry and wet caves, and Nuno joined in the search for a relationship between Peter's whereabouts. Since the police did not allow them to enter the water, Nuno and the others had to explore and look for Peter in the dry cave area. During this period, Nuno discovered that the dry cave area had a narrow entrance leading to the wet water area, thus confirming the existence of a water connection between the dry cave and the wet water cave. It took 3 days for Nuno and volunteers from the Cave Society to widen the narrow entrance to the dry cave area, and after passing through the entrance, they found Peter's footprints at a dead end that led to the rock. Eventually, Peter's body was found at the junction between the dry cave and the water source Peter's air pocket, next to an oxygen-filled but long-damaged oxygen cylinder. It can be seen that Peter must have believed that someone would come to save him before his death, so he would knock the oxygen cylinder beyond recognition. It was heart-wrenching that police divers had arrived during the search and rescue and were only 100 feet away from Peter, and they almost came to his rescue. However, the divers did not go deep into the cave to investigate, and Peter did not make a sound, so they passed by. As for Peter's footprints found by members of the Cave Society, they had already been discovered during the search phase, when the discoverer reported the clue to the police, but the police did not respond. By mistake, Peter, who could have been saved, died in a dark cave. When Peter's body was found, the state of the body made it impossible for them to imagine what Peter had been through during his lifetime. Judging by the state of Peter's beard, he died about 3 weeks after he was trapped, during which time Peter lost about 44 pounds and shrunk to the size of a child. The autopsy revealed that Peter had a lot less flesh on his body, and it was speculated that it was likely that Peter was so hungry that he had to eat his own flesh to live. But there is no basis for such speculation. The members of the Dry Cave Society saw the cover of the flashlight that Peter had removed next to his body, where there was no food but plenty of fresh water. So when Peter was too hungry to stand it, he removed the lid of the flashlight and used it as a water cup and drank fresh water to stay alive. However, drinking water does not provide energy, and the medical examiner believes that Peter's body began to break down the function of muscle tissue without any food to provide energy, resulting in a situation of less meat. As you can imagine, every second of his life was torture for Peter for the long 3 weeks. Eventually, Peter died of excessive hunger. Next to Peter's body are his last words to the world. "I love you, Shirl and Ma." They are Peter's wife and mother. When Peter was in the dark and boundless cavern, he could think back to the warm time with them to briefly dispel the pain of muscle breakdown and the fear of death coming. After Peter's death in the Sterkfontein cave, local authorities banned any individual or group from entering the cave for activities such as diving and measuring the depth of the cave, taking into account the danger of the cave and the difficulty of underwater rescue. However, due to the great archaeological value of the Sterkfontein cave and the popularity of the Peter event, the cave has now become a site. At present, some areas of the dry cave of the Sterkfontein cave are available to tourists for a fee. If you have the chance to travel to South Africa, would you like to experience this mysterious and dangerous cave for yourself? Back to the point, Peter Verhulsel's story ends here, but who is to blame for his death? Curiosity is human nature, and reasonable curiosity can promote the development of world civilization and lead mankind to break through the limitations of the unknown. But Peter's curiosity lacks rational control, and after being freed from the rope of reason, he put himself in a very dangerous situation and finally satisfied his fierce curiosity, but at the cost of his own life.